Professor is one of dub music's most legendary and prolific producers. He played a huge role in the second wave of dub in the UK, and in the 80s he helped the transition from analog to digital recording techniques, and even still, his love for analog shines through, with him continuing to run one of the few remaining analog studios to this day. He was born Neil Fraser in Guyana in 1955. He developed his nickname from his curiosity and obsession with electronics, and when he moved to England at age 13 and started experiencing the culture surrounding the music there, he got his curiosity more piqued and started building amplifiers and other equipment, as well as his own mixing boards, and eventually would start his very own studio, Ariwa Sounds, in his own South London house in 1979. His unique and diverse array of crafted sounds attracted a myriad of artists to his studios, and is now one of the longest running studios on the planet, with hundreds of albums being produced and an endless supply of unreleased materials. During a time when not a lot of people were paying attention to the engineer behind the tracks, Mad Professor utilized and implemented his dub techniques and stereo sound to introduce himself and build a new relationship with his listeners. After a few years, the studio gathered a few too many complaints from the neighbors, and he changed locations and continued to play his seminal contributing role in developing reggae music in the UK, working with major Jamaican artists like the likes of Lee Scratch Perry. He would make many albums with him together and learn a ton from him, but the very first album to come out of Ariwa's second location was one of his own. It would be his Dub Me Crazy album, and with help from John Peel's radio play, it developed enough popularity that it became the first in a series of many dub albums that Mad Professor would release. There's a dozen of them in total, I believe, and going through them can provide some fun insight into the evolution of the genre a bit. He would then follow it up with a 5-part series titled Black Liberation Dub, and has recently released a 2-part retrospective dub series titled 40 Years of Dub, where he goes through a bit of the back catalog that he's amassed over the 40-year period of making dub music. He's opened my eyes and greatly improved my understanding of a keystone musical movement, and I was lucky enough to find this. The 9th release in the Dub Me Crazy series, released in 1990. This is Mad Professor's Science and the Witchdoctor. Dub Me Crazy Part 9! The artwork on this series is a lot of fun, eccentric blending of colors, objects, and mediums, with Afro imagery that's super vibrant and reflective of the wild and diverse mix that it entails. Regardless of whichever dub effects and sampling he chooses, the Mad Professor always manages to imbue his style with this reggae tone vibe and the creative tonal quality that's uniquely his own. If you're unable to locate this particular entry in the Dub Me Crazy series, don't worry, just grab what you can get. You'll still understand what I'm talking about. While they're all a little bit different than the last, they're still well-aged dub albums that harken back to the beginnings of digital dance music and fill in some much-needed gaps I had in the evolution of that genre from the 80s to the 90s. The man's been around for so long, it's pretty easy to just talk about Mad Professor in general terms, but for the sake of this video, reflecting its title a little bit better, I'm gonna get a little bit into the specifics, talk about this particular iteration of the Dub Me Crazy series and the songs on it. Whoa. Starting out with the opener that reminds me of another band I've already reviewed. This one's called Anansi Skunk. It's got a fantastic underlying bass group that could carry most songs all on their own, and it's surrounded by this repeated dubbed up vocal hook and all sorts of steel instrumentation from drums to guitars. A trippy, subverted reggae funk beginning to this enjoyably wacky LP. Natural Fact lulls the listener into a chill trance, and the transition between this project and an early electronic album becomes even more apparent on the following Blue Ball Fire, with both their looping drum lines and futuristic additions and interjections that drone in and out. As someone who was born closer to the emergence of dubstep than dub. This connection took me a lot longer than it should have to make. The album opens up a bit more, cools off for some spaced out ambient cuts like Cry the Higyu and Jumbie Umbrella. Then the Legend of Zelda-like intro on Baku and the Bottle brings up the tempo a bit, and these great trumpet samples really fill that song out nicely. I've got to make a note about the transitions between the tracks here, as they could almost become songs their own if they were more fleshed out, and that's maybe a complaint I have about this whole project, is some of the ideas aren't fully worked through, or maybe a little overworked even. I think its consistent vocal hook makes the coming of the Obey Man more immediately memorable, but I also think it'll be the reason this track either grows on you or does the opposite, because outside of the slick grooves and guitar melodies, Mad Professor is doing everything he can to mess with that vocal hook, throwing in all kinds of reverbs and effects to distort it every which way. Those Zelda vibes permeate the entirety of Boraseed, it being pretty much the dopest shop music you could ever get in the whole Ocarina of Time. If the Gorons had a head shop, this would be the song playing in it. And then it's followed up by Witch's Brew, which sits in a similar but kind of adjacent lane, it also being this sort of passive, comfortable, and sedative number. Then strong Rasta vibes flow out of Hollow Coco dub. It keeps this project smooth and maintains a steady groove. It's more grounded than the previous pair and brings a brief period of more energy to the end of this project. Some of my favorite vocal dubbing comes up on Mistaken Identity. The Mad Professor's echoing and reverbing, he's stretching and he's layering to create this entrancing, ethereal effect that makes for a highlight right before the closer here. H2SO4 is the most hip-hop influenced track here, but with invasive, fuzzy drums that then shifts into this hyper-futuristic sort of laser funk song about 2 minutes in. Really, they just throwing everything in the kitchen sink at this final track here. With this album coming basically right in the middle of his production and management heyday, it's really no surprise that a few of the songs are either under or overdone, but it also still remains a fabulous example of the many techniques and intricate soundscapes that he was capable of crafting, and probably still is. Perhaps it was a bit rushed and maybe not his primary focus at the time, but this is still an impressive product that's consistent and re-listenable enough to warrant talking about him over 30 years later. There's certainly some method behind this man's madness. Continually creative, he's still sonically active to this day. His complex technical insights, creative drive, and clear passion for engineering new sounds keeps him at the forefront of dub production. He's had an overwhelming influence over the past 40 years, and he's worked all over the globe with a massive list of legendary artists. I'm looking forward to continue sampling his sounds and trying out his endless lists of albums and picking up more Ariwa CDs. Let me know your favorite Mad Professor or Ariwa release down in the comments below, and make sure you leave a like for making it to the end of the video. If you're interested in more Mad tunes, check out the description. I've linked all the music I've talked about, and if you want more throwback album retrospectives, make sure you subscribe and check out these two artists that Mad Professor has done some work with in the past. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I'll see you next week. Take care. Anansi.